SportsLit is co-founded and co-hosted by Neil Acharya and Nate Sager. Technical producer and engineer, Michael Ella. Executive producer, Neil Acharya.
Welcome. Melissa Ludtke is our guest discussing her long-awaited book, Locker Room Talk, A Woman's Struggle to Get Inside. It is from Rutgers University Press with an August 16th, 2024 publication date, with UBC Press handling Canadian distribution. And remember to check sportslit.ca for all of our archive. I am Nathan Sager. At the start of Locker Room Talk, Melissa Ludtke expresses hope that her book, quote, demonstrates why it was worth fighting for equal rights then and why this remains a vital endeavor. The case of Ludtke v. Kuhn was long ago, but it could seem like yesterday or 3 months right from now with the tropes that were in play. Well-connected, powerful, privileged men who persisted in trying to make choices for women and other out-grouped people, and the media giving oxygen to that kind of just fear-based negative energy that has a lot of other terms with it, misogyny, sexism. It's heavy stuff, but sports is a mirror of public life, and at the end of the day, we all want to win. And getting to ask Melissa Ludtke about her book, about the effects of her equal rights case, and her messages to younger generations, it's like a summer Christmas for our little show. When Neil Acharya and I learned of this book around Christmas of 2023, we're like, wow, this is in our wheelhouse. A history maker, a woman in sports who's went on to do great advocacy journalism, plus, sports in the courts and just, love of the game, in this case, baseball. So full disclosure about some irony and oddity with our production. Work to everyone's mutual benefit was to clear some time to chat with Ludtke the week of July 21st to 27th, 3 weeks out from our publication date, and then we would, produce it when we had the chance. That gave her a chance to be expansive about her case and her story. In my, humble role as host, I get to feel like, I'm the starting pitcher, and I threw my 7 solid innings, and then I'm going to go stick my pitching arm, my left arm, in the tub of ice. And then, Neil Acharya and Mike Ella, who've been full up with work obligations, when they're ready, they'll take over as the producers and come out of the bullpen throwing gas as the high leverage relief faces, just to completely strain the awkward baseball analogy. So that made it paramount to keep discussion on the book and the guest and sort of elide any current events that might tie in. And thankfully, there were none of those that week. Other than that, on July 21st, U.S. President Joe Biden said he was not seeking re-election, and Vice President Kamala Harris becomes the likely Democratic nominee. And we're interviewing a guest who was part of a landmark gender equality case, and one of the jacket blurbs is from Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton, who, by the way, called Joe Biden's choice, quote, as pure an act of patriotism as I have seen in my lifetime. And we're just got to be like, we're on the highway, we're in our lane. And yes, I see that way over off in the, on the horizon, but we just got to keep going. And I use that analogy since a close friend actually who was vacationing, actually stopped for the night in the president's hometown of Scranton, Pennsylvania on July 21st. But he didn't use the President Biden Expressway. He was, as he put it, the GPS took us on a different route, and then we learned Joe was out. There really should be a term for when you experience the butterfly effect like that. The upshot, though, is there's so much to cover in the book and so much to cover with Melissa Ludtke. So she was the winning plaintiff in the federal court case that Time Inc., repped by famed lawyer Fritz Schwarz Jr., brought against the commissioner of Major League Baseball toward the end of 1977, and then it was in the courts all through the 1978 baseball season. It was in response to the patriarchal power trip that baseball commissioner Bowie Kuhn took against Ludtke, a Sports Illustrated reporter, when she was assigned to the games in New York during the 1977 World Series. Now, that World Series ranks pretty high on the modern baseball lore board. In the closeout game at Yankee Stadium, Reggie Jackson put a 3-home run bow on a year of turmoil for New York City. Summer of Sam, the Bronx Zoo Yankees, the Blackout, where, by the way, a young filmmaker named Spike Lee shot some of his first footage. Incredible scenes, and I'm just referring to the final game of that World Series, which you could watch on the MLB Vault YouTube channel. So after Jackson crushed that triumvirate of taters, in the postgame delirium, Ludtke was, quote, outside of the clubhouse, crushed against the wall. And that was all Kuhn, even though neither he or anyone else had said anything when Ludtke earned equal access at the tail end of the regular season and through the first round of the playoffs. So they went to court, arguing it under the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution, the Equal Protection Clause. Here, as a researcher, writer, and journalist who's been a Time correspondent and worked at Neiman Labs, Ludtke explains how, quote, 2 lawyers and this judge wrestled with the legal issues. And she also details how it played out in the court of public opinion and how that affected her and her life choices in her late 20s in the late 1970s. It really spoke to me. Now, and I'm probably going to sound like a famous fictional Scranton, Pennsylvania resident, Michael Scott, if I try to wax philosophical about feminism or true equality of opportunity. To me, just, KISS principle. Let her or they make their life choices, full stop, and, hold that space. Endlessly litigating this stuff just does not lead anywhere good. So, Ludtke's exclusion came about 5 years after Title IX kickstarted the recovery of women's athletics. It also came less than 5 years after tennis's Battle of the Sexes, where Billie Jean King beat Bobby Riggs, inspiring so many girls and women and probably putting a lot of guys on the spot. Locker room talk also fills in a lot of gaps about what Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the later Supreme Court Justice, was doing to push gender equality rights in American courts in that era. But luckily also shows how the media twisted the story by going hook, line, and snicker into this, but the nudity meme. And, it was played for laughs on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson and on Saturday Night Live. Baseball columnists, were all high dudgeon about her being there. It's disappointing to read when there are people whose work you've read and quoted. I think it sort of gets into what happens with the sort of meme culture that is now everywhere with the modern communication arts, and what happens to a person when they get just reduced into an avatar whose mere name and image will bring out hot thoughts. And those often downward spiral into hate against someone for just participating in public life. And if we want good leaders, and we're going to need them, if you heard our episode with Dr. Madeline Orr about her book Warming Up earlier this summer, I think we're going to need to help everyone fine-tune their internal GPS to go a different route. Yes, I am real fun at parties. Anyway, baseball really took an L about its attitudes when women such as Ludtke, Diane Shaw, Claire Smith, Stephanie Salter, the late Canadian scribe Allison Gordon joined the baseball beat. I've heard some stories about treatment Allison Gordon received as a Toronto Blue Jays beat writer 40 years ago. She wrote about that in the book Foul Balls, likely still the best book written about my, first sporting love and favorite sports team. Why it had to be that way, I guess there was just a lot of conditioning that people hadn't sat with and let marinate, to use a line from Letterkenny. One convenient sample cited in this podcast is in John U. Bacon's episode in 2022, and my mom, Kathy Sager, and her "Where Were You in 72" story in the intro. That kind of sexism about women covering sports, it just hung in the air, hangs still. Thinking of how recent guest Ivanka Osmak not long ago noted, there's still times when you look around and like, I'm the only woman here. I guess the other bonkers part about baseball's reaction to Ludtke is that it was a rearguard action. The progress was already underway, as we find out in Locker Room Talk. Post Billie Jean King in 1974, the year Ludtke got on staff at Sports Illustrated through sheer hustle, Hockey Night in Canada actually hired their first on-air woman. I don't think it's mentioned in the book, but it was Helen Hutchinson, and they had her do interviews. Melissa also notes around that time, newspapers would have like one sports reporter, and they would usually be assigned to the NBA or NHL because those weren't as big a beat as baseball. And maybe we can draw a straight line to the 1975 Hockey All-Star Game in Montreal and the first two women reporters who went in the room. Some hockey men, Ludtke relates, were absolutely dreadful to the late Robin Herman from the New York Times. I have read on Radio Canada, radio reporter Marcel Saint-Cyr of CKLW on 570 AM from Laval, Quebec. Well, she said that she and the French-speaking players she needed tape from, they got through it. However, awkwardly, she said, Guy Lafleur exclaimed, "Ben Chris, t'es là," which is roughly, "Oh Christ, you're here." And they shared a laugh like adults and were flexible and handled it. Anyway, I guess a moral of the story that I took as a reader, from the book itself, is that, women in the locker room lingered into culture due to, weak, knee-jerky leadership from the men. Now, of course, access has changed, but these debates and credential checks, it all takes place on social media. And I think I saw a tweet from Mina Kimes of ESPN saying, this is just so tiring and boring. And we want sports to be exciting and fun. So why wouldn't we want the most talented word workers, be they writers or broadcasters, to be around it? So I sort of treat the book as a bit of a retrospective referendum on the kind of leadership you want with something where you're a fan. And I guess I like the leaders who really try to get out front, because the root word is lead. I've gotten fond of, since, Acharya and I had Ken Dryden as a guest, quoting an epigram that's in the class: "The mainstream outlasts every decision maker." Something I also am cross-referencing comes from my actual city councillor here in Hamilton, Ontario, Cameron Kretsch. And it had nothing to do with sports, but as he put it, "I've always believed that good leaders not only accept but embrace meaningful change. They lead us through the tough parts, even when the conversations are difficult and public support isn't unanimous." And he could have said that about any of the aspects of Locker Room Talk. So much gratitude that Melissa Ludtke wrote this very reflective book. I will also shout out, please visit her Substack, Let's Row Together, which will be full of info about the influence of the book and where she's going to be touring it through the late summer and the fall. And of course, please visit SportsLit for our catalog of solid guests and links to buy the books. We've already made as many episodes this year as we had in any previous calendar year. And I guess we're coming up on our little all-star break. We're taking it at more than halfway point, just like Major League Baseball. Trust me, it makes sense somehow. And now, let's get into Locker Room Talk, and then we'll all go touch some grass. Melissa Ludtke, welcome to SportsLit. So great to finally connect with you.
It's fabulous to be together with you. We talked about this for a while, and it's just sort of amazing that both my book is out, not really out, but it's out in pre-orders, which people have been emailing me pictures of their books arriving and them holding them. Doesn't really come out until a month from now, but it all feels real, and being with you today makes it feel more real.
Oh, I'm glad I can get like the, in hockey terms, like the 97th assist on that.
Absolutely.
I wanted to, just as a warm up, because this is something I only learned about recently, and I'm a huge baseball nerd. But what's the female agency and female fandom reflect, and make it sound like it's a dissertation, but you don't have to give one, in the song we all sing at the seventh inning stretch, "Take Me Out to the Ball Game"?
Well, you're just coming to it maybe a few months or even maybe a year later than I did. It's only been recently that I actually took time to figure out what was beyond the chorus that I must have sung 1,000 times, if not more. Take me out to the ball game. I mean, how many times did I sing those words about Cracker Jacks and, root, root, root for the home team and, everything about it, that seventh inning stretch. And finally, one day I got an article and I just was mesmerized because here I was learning about Jack Norwood, who wrote it in 1908. When we dig into the history, we find out that he had never been to a ball game. He actually never did go to a ball game until something like 1940. From the history, it appears that he may have written it. He does say that he was inspired being on the subway in New York one day and seeing a sign, I think for I think it was a ball game may have been Ebbets Field, but it was one of the parks in New York. And that inspired him to take out a scrap piece of paper and write a song, which he claims to have written in 15 minutes, and then later collaborated with a songwriter to put it to the music that we all know today. But there are various stories, and one of the things that's fascinating is, of course, as you say, the agency that he gives in this song to a woman who refuses the offer that her boyfriend makes, which seems perfectly wonderful, to go to a Broadway show. She says, no, take me out to the ball game. That's where I want to be. And when she gets to the ball game, we find out that she knows everything there is to know about baseball. She knows the players. She's shouting at the umpire. She's eating the Cracker Jack. She's doing everything you would do at a ball game. And the guy has acquiesced. He's taken her there, and she's very happy. So here we are with a song that was written in 1908, in which the heroine of it, is a woman who loves baseball. And yet, when I talk about baseball today, I often start with a phrase, with a paragraph from story that was written by a poet named Donald Hall, who writes about, sort of the passing down of baseball through the generations from fathers to sons. It's always fathers to sons. There's nothing about the passage of it from a father to a daughter or a mother to a daughter, which is, in my case, the way that I came to love baseball. The other side of it, which is a little intriguing of Jack Norwood, is that it appears that he might have been inspired also by a woman with whom he was having an affair at the time, who was an actress named Trixie Ferganza. And Trixie was a suffragette. So we're even adding another realm of sort of female agency to this. And the suffragettes at the time, when you go back and look at the history, decided that that's where the men were. So the suffragettes would sell tickets to a game, and they would go and plaster things about the suffrage movement all over the game. They would give them fans that had suffragette things on. So it may have been that Trixie, had sort of waxed eloquent one day with him about the suffrage movement in baseball. So we don't know how all the pieces fit together, but I just love it that we go back now more than a century, and this song that everyone sings together, very few people know anything beyond the chorus. And what's beyond the chorus is the story that intrigued you when you heard it and just absolutely grabbed me. And I just have run with it ever since. I just think it's fabulous. So
yeah, and I think I only knew of the fact that it's a female perspective because I'm an official scorer with the Intercounty Baseball League up here, and the version in Hamilton that we have plays a little bit of the third verse, and you hear about Nellie Kelly loved baseball games, and I think in the original version it's Katie Casey. So now my other sort of warm-up exercise question, Melissa, was what channels had to be worked through in order to get the former United States Secretary of State and Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton to blurb your book?
Well, in some ways, that goes back to another female institution, and that is Wellesley College, which is our alma mater. And when you are a graduate of Wellesley College, you are a sister of other people who have come before you in that experience. I can't say that she and I met at the college because she graduated in the spring with that very famous moment where she gets up and gives a commencement address as the student voted from that class to sort of respond to Senator Edward Brooke, who's the speaker that day, protesting the war in Vietnam and other issues of that time. I arrive in the fall of 1969 at Wellesley College, so she has just left. And it wasn't till years later that our lives intersected. But once they intersected, we discovered the Wellesley connection, and some others, we have become friends through the years. So it was really reaching out to a friend at this point. But our connection in life came really through both of our interests in children's issues. At the time I met her, she was chairing the board of the Children's Defense Fund. And that was something she was doing with Marion Wright Edelman, one of her first jobs, out of law school, but was working there. And then she became the chairman of the board when she lived in Arkansas and was the governor's wife. She was a lawyer also herself at that time. And I ended up on a retreat, maybe more than you want to know, but it's kind of a fun story. I ended up on a retreat of all places to Martha's Vineyard one summer. It was a 3-day retreat where Marion Wright Edelman brought together people from across the nation that had an interest in bringing the children's voice into the election that was coming up then in 1988. And I went to that as a correspondent for Time magazine. She had people from the media, people from religious institutions, et cetera. And, Hillary Clinton was there in her role as the chairman of the board, and she brought her husband for the occasion. And I was put into a very small working group, and in that working group was her husband, Bill Clinton. So I was with him much more during that weekend of 4 of us in a working group where we'd come back into the large group. Anyway, suffice it to say, we were staying in the same hotel, and we got to know each other very well. And the inspiration for me out of that gathering was to go back to Time magazine, and I suggested a story called Through the Eyes of Children, where I then traveled for 6 months around the country, living with families, trying to talk about what it was like to see the world as a child through the child's eyes and the child's experience at that time. And at one point along the way, I needed a break. And in Martha's Vineyard, the 2 of them had been lovely and said, if you ever want to come by, just give us a call in Arkansas. And I did. So I went and stayed with them for about 5 days in Arkansas. And so it's a friendship. And she's been incredible. I worked a little bit with her on her first book, It Takes a Village. We've been in touch through the years, and I look at her as a mentor to me, and we correspond by letter, old-fashioned, sit-down type of letter.
And I've always heard, and I remember hearing this from someone who works in hockey, they said, what they've heard is, I want to say Mrs. Clinton. I'm being respectful.
Secretary Clinton.
Secretary Clinton. Yeah, that's my Canadianness showing through. Sorry. That she's just wonderful to work for. I guess
we've had so let's put it this way: we've had some great laughs over the years, and also obviously we've shared moments in each of our lives that have been sad ones. So I feel like it's a genuine friendship, and one that I felt very, very comfortable asking her if she would do it. And although we don't have a date on the calendar yet, there is a discussion that we've had, and there is a promise that we will be doing an event in New York together, probably in the early winter, after she finishes her book tour for her book that just came out and is more settled down after the election, et cetera. So hopefully people in New York will look forward to that.
Yeah. And I should just let the listeners in, just to be full disclosure, we're recording this basically the day after President Biden said he's not running for re-election, but we're going to have a little time lag because of our our producer
That's right.
producers' schedules.
Yeah.
Before, who knows how things will have changed by the time this comes out.
Well, the deal with her was that she was going to be involved in some ways in the election, and obviously working for whichever the candidate was in the Democratic Party, and we would get together after that and figure out a date. So it's to be confirmed.
Okay, and so I should bring this around to the book. How fair is it to say, well, it's your story? You really wanted to show like how much women throughout the ages have loved baseball and had earned that chance to tell the story of baseball, the good, the bad, the needs to be worked on parts.
I think my inspiration for writing this book, and I am in my 70s now, so I'm really looking back almost 50 years with the benefit of an enormous document trail that can really reinforce my own memories and some of my journal writings, etc. And I have to say that my goal with this book, because when you write a book, you better have something that is of integrity to you, as it is such, to me, in some ways, it's both a labor of love, but an ordeal to really sit down and write a book. And this one is the first one I've really done that's really my life and telling my story, albeit at a very specific time. But back in the 70s, I had no control over how my story was told. And the people telling my story were predominantly men, because men predominantly covered sports at that point. I was a rarity. I say in the book that I was really the only woman covering baseball nationally full time, which I was for Sports Illustrated. But the woman whose job I had taken over at Sports Illustrated, who had been the baseball reporter before me, was out on the West Coast working in San Francisco. She was covering the Giants and the A's, but she was also doing more than that. She was, a columnist, etc. So she wasn't solely focused on baseball. But really, we were probably the only two in the country at that point who were women who were covering the sport. So when it came time for a story to be told about what people characterize as my invasion of the sport, having the temerity, the audacity to think that a woman could be part of this, could know enough about the game to cover it. The men were really I think, a mixture of angry at me. They were frightened by what would happen if, in fact, I was successful in doing this job and what it would mean if more women came into it. It was very much a boys' club. And so the story was told from the perspective of really the player's anatomy and not my quest for equal access or equal rights. In fact, the only time that the words equal rights were used by men in the coverage of this story was when they jokingly said that if I won my case, then maybe they, could go into the women's locker room and see Chrissy Everett, who was the reigning tennis champion at the time. Maybe they could see her undressed, and that would be equal rights. There were cartoons where players would hold up, male underwear and say, hey, sweetheart, put this on and we'll be equal. So again, the only question of equality always had to do with some part of the male anatomy and what Commissioner Bowie Kuhn liked to call my invasion of their sexual privacy. So 50 years later, one of my real reasons for writing the book was, for the first time in my life, really, to have the chance to tell the story through the way that I lived it and the way that I saw it. And I saw it as a fight for equal rights. And that's a story that exists in a long arc of stories of women who have fought for equal rights before me and have continued to fight for them afterwards. And unfortunately, in our country right now, women are going to have to go back and refight some of the fights that my generation fought for and won in the 70s. So I think it's a really fitting story for now to place it in the realm of an equal rights story and not a story that worries about whether men will be naked in my presence, which they did not have to be. So.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Yeah. There's parts of it that seem so, far back. I mean, I'm a middle-aged person. Then there's parts where it's like when you look at the power dynamic, it's like this could have happened yesterday. This could happen next week. Am I sort of in the ballpark?
Yeah, you are. I mean, it is happening in the issue of transgender rights right now. It is happening as we try to sort through a lot of these issues. I just wrote a Substack last week about the origins of sex testing in the Olympics and sort of the long history of that, which when I began to go back and research it, realized it's almost a century old. This is not something that we just came to yesterday. And yet throughout the history, you can see when Phyllis Schlafly came in to try to defeat the Equal Rights Amendment in our country, which was happening at the same time as my lawsuit, by the way. That was a simultaneous situation. What she focused on is the same kind of wedge issues that are focused on today, which is what's going to happen in bathrooms. So the locker room was a very sort of evocative place for a lot of people to be persuaded that it wasn't a place that I should be. And they could not get to the point of looking at it from the perspective, if I had a job to do and I had to interview the athletes, then to say that I could not be where the male sports writers were in interviewing them was basically a gender discrimination issue that was really an employment issue. But it had to do with a policy that was supposedly saying that if you treated me separately in some way, you tried to bring players out to me or whatever, that would be equal. And in fact, we had a case in 1954, Brown v. Board of Education, that the Supreme Court ruled on that clearly indicates that you cannot pretend that to treat people in a separate location, in a separate way, is to make their opportunity or their experience equal to that of, in my case, the male sports writers.
Mm-hmm. And we will definitely get to that when we talk about the case, because I'm just like, wow, this, and sometimes you tend one's reading history, you tend to take a straight line. This happened and then happened.
Yeah.
Melissa, we were hoping you would read, and I think I flagged a passage for you a few days ago. It was just about the value of standing up for yourself and for other women.
Okay, you gave me a piece to read. Before I read it, I want to be sure that people know who the characters are when I come to them, because it's pulled out a little. One of the names that you're going to hear is Uberoth. And that is Peter Uberoth, who had just come from successfully running the Los Angeles Olympics in 1984 that I covered. This is now 6 years after the decision in my case. And Bowie Kuhn, who was the commissioner who had taken to court because of him banning me from locker rooms, had essentially lived up to his word, which is that he would not lift a finger to try to make equal access happen any more than the court insisted that he do. And it was not until Peter Uberoth replaced him as commissioner after he'd done his tenure at the LA Olympics that we see the policy change be enunciated and written down by the commissioner. So this is 6 years after my court decision comes down. So I'm talking here about a piece in the New York Times that had commented on what Uberoth had done. So I just kind of wanted to set the context. That's okay.
Oh, for sure.
And I write in my book, I felt the Times' optimistic spin missed a larger mark. Even years later, Uberoth's commendable action did not end the disrespectful treatment of women, just as our fight for equal access had not ended with Judge Motley's district court order. In my case, Uberoth's directive could not rid baseball of the traditional attitudes that had stymied our progress for too long. Baseball had aligned its media policies with Judge Motley's decision, but the verbal and sexual harassment and the abusive treatment of women who did this job had not abated. In fact, it had intensified as women were seen increasingly as posing a real threat to the game's conventional ways. Even now, women in sports media deal with misogyny as part of their jobs, as many detractors objectify them sexually, while others threaten their safety. But today, these women have what I did not have: fellow female travelers who have their backs, along with the solidarity of the powerful Association for Women in Sports Media, which did not exist in my day. Today, these young women speak up and shout back, which I didn't do, perhaps because I was alone. And I admire how they stand up to intimidation, though I know that often their treatment drives women out of the jobs they love doing. Yeah, Ludtke v. Kuhn pushed locker room doors open for women, and I've watched with delight as tens of thousands of women walk through them, then demonstrated with their stories and broadcasts that they belong there. I've cheered the courage of women who keep on pushing against forces thwarting our progress. I marvel at these women proving their mettle as writers, broadcasters, columnists, editors, producers, and directors, each woman working in an arena that men once ruled and worked hard to be sure that women like me would not despoil.
Thank you so much. And I guess that also did show just something that someone in that position goes through too, just confronting, how much of yourself and what of yourself you're going to bring to that storytelling. How valuable, and maybe shame bad on me that I have to ask, but how much do we just need to reiterating? It's important to have these different perspectives, and that women who are in the sports media, game aren't just trying to be one of the guys.
Well, that's so interesting you just said that, because as part of my book early on, I do pull back from my rendering of the court hearing and talk about sort of my very earliest days going up to ballparks once I was given the press passes that came along with being given the baseball beat at Sports Illustrated. And in fact, my first instinct, and I think it might be today were I in the same circumstances of being the only woman in a sea of men, was that I felt that the only thing I should do, or the best thing I should do, would be to learn how to do this job like the men did it. I should follow them, because where else was a roadmap for me? And so I learned really how to do the job by hanging around the guys. I mean, I would hang around the batting cage, and I would really listen to the kind of questions they asked the players. I would begin to understand when to approach players and when not to, based on what they said and did. I would sit in the huddle with them when the manager came out and listen to the back and forth. I would listen to their follow-up questions. It took me quite a while to get a sense that I could do what they were doing. I understood the game. I knew it. I'd watched it. I'd loved it. I'd grown up with it. But for some reason, I felt like I had different questions I wanted to ask. And I came to understand only years later that I think those questions came out of a different socialization that I went through growing up as a girl. My life was much more relational in a certain way. I came to understand that when I took some courses at Harvard University during a fellowship year with Carol Gilligan, who had really done the research on the relational aspects of girls growing up. And I wanted to understand more the connections between the players, the team, how they all worked. In fact, the feature story I wrote for the baseball issue at Sports Illustrated was called The Despot and the Diplomat. And it was an entire feature story looking at the game within the game that takes place between the umpire and the catchers, which had never been written before in the history of baseball. And I knew that from going to our research library. But that's what interested me. The men, because many of them, first of all, were writing for daily newspapers and not for magazines, were much more interested in particulars of that game. I had a broader view of the game because I was with the magazine. And so I really had to, in the end, find my own style, my own way. But one thing that was absolutely certain in my mind is that before I went up for any game, I had to do a lot of research because I did not want to run into a situation where I wasn't making sense with a player about statistics, about what had happened in prior games, etc. I knew that I was under watch by the men around me. And if I was to make mistakes, they would be magnified. And it would be proof to people that I didn't belong where I was. So I was very, very careful to understand that framing my first question to a ball player, it was important for me to show that I knew what I was saying, but not without being, a showboaty about it. It was a very delicate mix and nuance, but I also had to come across as someone who was serious, that I wasn't, a piece of fluff, as Red Smith once referred to me in a column he wrote, The Fluff in the Locker Room, that I was someone who knew the game and was there to do my work and do my job, and a job I loved. So it was a delicate balance. But when you talk about sort of doing the job like the men did it, what other role models did we have?
Yeah. And I admit I probably was guilty of that lots of times. Like, what does she know? Or what does this younger guy know? Because I'm, one friend calls me Natipedia all the time for. There you are. I was the kid who sat there and read all, before the internet. I sat there and read all the record books and everything. But I guess this really does show that goes to show like about, not like, sort of leaving parts of your identity outside of the ballpark when you come in, because when you work in the media and being, supportive, there were a couple of times when just like when you were describing some of the interview experiences you had, like I think the time on the Today Show, I'm not trying to throw in like the interviewer under the bus. Jane Pauley's still around, but that kind of just made my heart sink, and I was like, "Oh man!" Like,
yeah, she came into me at the end of the interview with just kind of a very odd conversation that I had just trying to get my nerves settled when she had first come to sit across from me, and there was a picture of Reggie Jackson behind us on the set that had been made on the Today Show for us to do our interview. And there you could see his chest. And from the angle of the photograph, the chest was just absolutely enormous. I mean, it filled up the whole photograph as though it was taken from, below and sort of coming up. And I think in my just trying to have a chit chat of some kind with her before we actually went into the interview, I must have said something like, "Oh my God, look at Reggie's chest," or something, because it was just the oddity of the angle and stuff. And she turned that into me asking her if that was Reggie Jackson's chest. And if in fact I was doing that, she asked me this on live TV. Who were we not to think that the only reason that I actually wanted to be there was to leer at naked athletes? We had just gone through 5 minutes of an interview where I was talking about why I had gone to court, how much I loved the job, the question of the equal access, why I needed it, etc. And yet the interview ended with that uncomfortable repartee between the two of us, in which I tried to regain my equilibrium after sort of being hit by that question. And then she sort of swivels around and she says, "Well, we can only imagine what the gender of that camera inside the locker room was." And thank you very much, Melissa Ludtke. And I'm like, really? This was the first interview I had done, on this case. And it was just, I don't know. It was just
Yeah.
a different, an unreal, surreal moment that I do recount at some length in my book. So, yeah.
Yeah. Co-host Neil Acharya, who's busy with the Olympics right now, and we one of the things we always bonded over way back when was the rap group Public Enemy, and I think it was Chuck D's epigram, not every brother's a brother, and certainly it could also be not every sister is a sister. That I do want to talk about before we get to the case, though. When we had Ken Dryden on a while ago, two things I took out of it were Ken's line, "The mainstream outlasts every decision maker," but also, sort of calling on people to look for the commonalities. And what was your, and I've heard you talk about this with other interviewers, Melissa, what was your sort of immersion into sports fandom like as a girl, and really how much different would have been for, a man born in the same generation in the same part of the United States?
Well, I think it all comes down to my family, frankly. My family was one where we had 5 children. There were 4 daughters and a boy in the middle. And my father didn't wait for the boy to get old enough before he decided that he was taking his 2 oldest daughters to football games for UMass Amherst, where he was a professor every week. So we would go to the home games, but we'd also go on the road. We'd go to Holy Cross and Harvard and BC, and we'd sit in the stands. And he taught me football. Now, he was from the Midwest. My mother was from the East Coast, and she had grown up at Fenway Park, being the seatmate to my my grandfather. And she was such an incredible baseball fan that she, hung pictures of the teams around the corners of her bedroom. She scored every game. She had a scrapbook of every story. She went to Fenway Park with him. She taught me how to score games early. When I was born in 1951, I was born in Iowa because my parents had gone out there after the war and were in the process of getting their master's degree and a PhD. And I was born right before that. And so a letter came from her seatmate, her father, back in Milton, Massachusetts. And he spells my name wrong and says, "Oh, it's so exciting. She's born." And then the next 2 paragraphs are a total recap of the Yankees Boston 3-game series that he had not been able to pull himself away from to write the letter until the Yankees had left town and Boston had swept them 3-0. And he was recounting for her inning, sort of by inning. So I say to people that was a mark when I found that letter after her death. She had saved all of these letters, and I opened it up and I said, my God, I was born with this DNA. I mean, the baseball was there at birth. I almost had no choice. But in fact, as I write in the book, in 1951, no one would have ever imagined that a girl who was born into a baseball-loving family to a baseball-loving mother would ever possibly become a national reporter on baseball. That would have been just absolutely unheard of. So how did it happen? I mean, it happened because I lived in a university town. And unlike many girls in the 50s and 60s, I had the opportunity to play on sports teams. And so I did. I played every season on a sports team. I would play volleyball in the fall. I would play basketball in the winter, and I'd play tennis in the spring. And in the summers, I'd do sailboat racing. And, I played everything that you could play. And so between my father at football games, my mother at baseball games, us listening to them on the radio, beginning to watch them on TV together, I learned to talk sports like boys talk sports. I was very comfortable in doing so. And that played the pivotal role in the serendipitous moment in my life where I was seated at a dinner table across from Frank Gifford, who at that time was just starting as the member of Monday Night Football with Howard Cosell and Dandy Don Meredith. And I sat across the dinner table for 2 hours. We did nothing but talk sports. After the dinner, he said to me, "For a girl, you know a lot about sports," which I took as an enormous compliment because he followed it right up. And he said, "If you're ever in New York, just let me know. I'd love to introduce you to the people at ABC Sports." And so at that moment, having graduated from Wellesley College with a degree in art history and being stymied at what I wanted to do, because I was ready to go out in the world, but I didn't want to work in a museum or an art gallery, plan B quickly became sports. And back then, I think a liberal arts degree sort of could give you almost a leg into almost anything. So I went down to New York. I met everyone at ABC Sports. He introduced me to, I think, every vice president, to Roone Arledge, the president. And I realized that my only foot in the door would to be a secretary and work my way up, the standard way that women thought of working their way up, because I certainly didn't have a sports broadcast degree or anything like that. And I went down and took the typing test. I learned to do stenography, and I went upstairs, and the one man held my resume in one hand and my typing and steno scores in another. And he turned to me and he said, well, they aren't bad scores, but when I look at your resume, you went to Wellesley College. I mean, I don't really think you want to be a secretary. We're not hiring you. And what I realized only years later was that it was because of a legal action. Because in the United States in 1970, the women at Newsweek had filed suit against Kay Graham, who owned Newsweek. She was the owner of the Washington Post. They filed it because women were hired as secretaries and file clerks and library staff, and the men who came from the same colleges with the same kind of background were hired as writers. And that became the dominoes falling across all the media. So, of course, in 1974, ABC Sports wasn't going to hire me as a secretary with a degree from Wellesley College, because that would just be fodder for a legal case if someone decided to come after them. So anyway, the law had a lot going on in the 70s. It was a very active time, and it was really a way.
And you really lay that out. And I didn't know quite how all the pieces connected. I know the TV, the book, and I'm blanking on the author's name.
The Good Girls Revolt. The Good Girls Revolt.
Good Girls Revolt.
Yes. Yeah, by Lynn Povich. And Lynn and I will be doing an event together actually at the New York Historical Society, looking back at the 1970s and the use of the law in terms of women and equal rights. So I'm going to come together with her on that to talk about her book and my book. So yes, you're right. Yep.
And in terms of the continuum, I watched the documentary Shutout. It came out maybe 2018, and it's about women in baseball. And your social development starts in the 1950s, and in that doc, political scientist Jennifer Ring says that was, quote, the worst decade in America to be an athletic girl. I can't imagine it was any different in Canada. Just what comes to mind in that era, that 1950s, 60s era, with just kind of this. I mean, you mentioned your hometown being an outlier. I have no instances of outliers in the area where I grew up, where my mother grew up. But what comes to mind with kind of, social pressure against, female sports participation back then when you were growing up?
Well, let's put it this way. In 7th grade, I decided, because it was the popular thing to do, that I should be a cheerleader, because people showed up to watch the boys play. And so they would show up to watch us cheer and get them going and cheering the boys on. And that was kind of the notion that that's what girls did. That's what boys did. And if you wanted to be sort of in the mix of what was happening and what was popular, that's what you did. But in 8th grade, I learned that girls could play basketball. And so that's the last of my cheerleading days. And I took to the basketball court. And I think on the basketball court, we see exactly what you're talking about. Because even though I had the opportunity to play the game, girls never got to play the game in my day in the way that the boys did. Of course, the boys could run the whole court. They were 5 to a team, just like now. They played offense, they played defense. Girls were viewed as too fragile, not strong enough. And so they decided that we would play on a smaller court. This is how I played the game. And half the court would be where if you were a stationary forward, imagine the word stationary forward in a basketball game. But if you were a stationary forward, you could only play on your side's offensive half of the court. Then there were 2 stationary guards. You could only play on that defensive side. And then there were 2 rovers. And so you could be a rover, you could go over that line and go the whole court. But a boy could, for example, take a rebound at one end of the court, and if he wanted to and he saw a clear path to it, he could just dribble all the way down and do a layup and he could score. No, I could be a rover, but if I took a rebound, I could only dribble the ball 3 times. I had to come to a stop. And then I had to throw the ball to someone else who could only dribble 3 times. And then she had to come to a stop. Well, think about what that is like. It's like watching 5-year-olds play soccer, where they're all together in a little group following the ball around the field, all with elbows out and charging into each other. It was when my daughter lost interest in playing soccer. Well, you can only imagine that when you are going to dribble 3 times, the team knows where you're going to end up. So they're all going to be around you like windmills all around you. And your only thing is going to be to bounce the ball or throw it to a teammate that's open. Then they're going to go over and they're going to be around. Anyway, let's just say that if we had a game that was a 11-8 game, that was lucky because there was very little scoring and it was just a really, really challenging way to try to learn to play basketball.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
So that was the era. I mean, that was really the era. I mean, I'm lucky because I did get to play rover a lot. And so I had some of the experiences of being able to, be a little more active than being a stationary forward. But anyway, that kind of epitomizes, I think, what sports were like for girls. And you're right. You look at the figures now. We all live in our bubbles when we're growing up. So I thought all girls had the kind of opportunities I did have, to play on these team sports and be able to do this. But lo and behold, I mean, I found out that very few did. Very few. Many, many women of my generation will tell me they never played sports when they were in school. They never played. There were no teams. There were no community teams. And it was also a time, if you go back and look at the legal history of it, that young girls who were 13, 14-year-olds in New Jersey and other states where the suits were very prominent, they were suing for the right to try out for a Little League team because they wanted to play baseball. The girls didn't have a softball team, but they wanted to play. The only thing they could play on was Little League. And they went to court. And fortunately, in many times, those cases, they won the case, but the case had taken so long that they'd aged out of Little League by then. So there were a lot of people in my generation who missed out on their opportunities to really play sports. That's absolutely right.
Yeah, and that's what I've come around to. And I think of our episode with Susie Rack 2 years ago about, history of women's soccer and how 100 years ago, women's soccer games in England drew 50,000 people. And then the FA said, well, you can't play anymore. And it was just like, what did we lose as, just as a society from this exclusion is just what, it keeps me up a little, or, it's one of my last thoughts as I'm drifting off to sleep. Now, Melissa, I just wondered how much in 1974 did you have to hustle to get a position at Sports Illustrated?
Well, again, I mentioned the opportunity I had to meet people at ABC Sports. And so through that experience of going down for what I thought was going to be maybe a 1 or 2 day trip, one of the last people that Frank introduced me to that day was the only woman producer at ABC Sports, and her name was Ellie Rieger. And I think she saw a young woman sitting across from her, and she said, I'm going to give her an opportunity here just to see what this business could be like. And so she invited me to stick around a few more days and come over with her all-woman crew. They were working on a special on women in sports because of the passage of Title IX and also the Battle of the Sexes, in which Billie Jean King had just beaten Bobby Riggs in the tennis match, which drew 90 million people from around the world watching it in the Houston Astrodome and on TV. So I stayed a few extra days, and I spent all of that time up in that studio with Ellie and her crew. Two things of a major consequence in my life happened in those days. One was that Billie Jean King walked into the studio. Now, can you imagine? I just watched her, be lifted up on the seat in Houston Astrodome and watched her win against Bobby Riggs, which was more than a tennis match. It was a cultural opening. It was extraordinary. And here she was. She walked in. So I said, my life is in sports media. That was one thing that happened. That was an internal. The external thing that happened is I met the production assistant working on that show, and her name was Barbara Roche. And eventually, when I called her again and said, I'm moving to New York, she said, I'm getting a new apartment. Would you like to get one with me? And I did that. And so every month, Barbara brought me what I called the keys to the kingdom. It was on paper at that point, stapled together, and it was the entire schedule for ABC Sports, the location in which everything was happening that ABC Sports would be doing, whether it was off-site events or whether it was in-town voiceovers that were being done in production studios. So I got a job as a secretary at a magazine, Harper's Bazaar, and every waking hour, except when I was at work to pay my rent, I was in a production studio over on the West Side, watching the people do the voiceovers, do the editing, meeting the producers, meeting the directors. On weekends, I'd go out and be a gopher, which was a go for that, go for this, $25 a day. And again, meeting everyone. It was as though I became a member of the staff without being a member of the staff. And what that was, and I didn't have a name for it at the time, but what it was networking. It was networking. I didn't know it at the time, but one of the producers came to me about 3 or 4 months into me doing this and said, I know the guy who hires over at Sports Illustrated. Would you like an introduction? To which I said, of course I would. And so I went over, had an interview. I thought I'd nailed it. I thought, wow, this is it. This is now what I want to do. This is it. And of course, I had no clips. I had nothing. And everyone who got jobs at SI at that time was a sports editor, University of Michigan or Penn State or somewhere. They had clip files like this from their college papers, thick. And so he wrote me a lovely rejection letter, which I put up on my wall. And so I continued going out to do events with ABC Sports on weekends, and I would send him postcards. And I would say, hello, I am up in the broadcast booth on the 18th tee of the U.S. Open at Mamaroneck with Henry Longhurst and ba-ba-ba. And I didn't make any of it up, but I wasn't necessarily saying, and I'm going to get coffee for him. So in September of that same year, this hiring person in the research department calls me back and says, could you come in for another interview? I came in and I was hired. It was a miracle. I mean, it scared the bejesus out of me because as soon as I moved into my desk and met my fellow reporters, I learned that all of them had covered sports, all of them in their college newspapers. Many of them had been leading editors, et cetera. And I thought, oh my God, where am I? I'd never written a story. The best I'd done is written a term paper in the passive voice. And here I am at Sports Illustrated, where you've got writers like Curry Kirkpatrick and Dan Jenkins. And I mean, it was like a whole nother universe. And so I was just damn lucky to be able to get it.
But you did hustle. You hustled.
I hustled. I hustled for it, and I got it. And from the beginning, I knew that my goal there, I hoped for goal, was to cover baseball in some way. And so when Stephanie Salter left in 1975, because if you were a woman working at Sports Illustrated then, and you actually wanted to write sports and be a writer, you usually had to leave being a reporter at Sports Illustrated. Jane Gross left to become a writer of basketball at the NBA. She became the first woman to go into the NBA locker rooms to gain equal access there. Stephanie Salter left and became a writer at the San Francisco Examiner. The woman I replaced had been a reporter at Sports Illustrated. She left. She became the editor of World Tennis magazine. But at SI, you weren't going up the ladder very quickly. So when Stephanie left, I had sort of demonstrated my interest in baseball by doing the baseball books, which was taking by hand and doing all the statistics every day of every game played, et cetera, et cetera. So our Baseball Week writer could write from those. And I had demonstrated that, so I ended up getting the second position as the baseball reporter. So anyway, it was all sort of just luck and demonstrating that I was going to really work hard. I mean, I worked hard, and I did it because I loved it. Loved it.
And that sort of segues too into how you went about it when you started going to Yankee Stadium. I've heard, how would you sort of explain what the gradualist approach you took to being at the ballpark and, around the ball players, or, being in the dugout when, Billy Martin's, talking about what his pitching decisions or whatnot?
Well, I was definitely a Mother May I girl. I was not, and as a lone person up there, again, as usually the only woman in the press box, the only woman on the field, it's a very challenging position to then suddenly think that you can demand anything or demand that there be change in terms of how my access would be made different. I obviously came to learn later, researching for this book, that there had been individual women, not women who had stuck around very long, but individual women who had been kept off the field, had been kept out of dugouts for interviews, had not been given seats in press boxes, had been told they couldn't eat their meals before the game with the rest of the sports writers. They were given separate tables with, words like Ladies Pavilion put on them. And I might point out to your listeners that in none of those instances was any man naked.
No.
So this is a history of exclusionary policies that I think arose out of, again, that fear that if they let one woman in, my God, the herd would come in, and then what would happen to the boys' club? So by the time I get there, because these other women had come and, had their own individual, kind of moments. Diane Shaw, when she was refused a credential and told that she would have to stay in the stands and not be able to go onto the field and she wouldn't get a seat in the press box, asked her male editor and the male lawyer for her magazine, this was in 1972, to call the Red Sox, who had told her this. And after the two men had spoken to them, particularly the lawyer, she had those credentials. Yeah. However, she's the one who was told, and who would think if you were a lawyer at a magazine that you should ask, will my reporter be eating with the male sports writers? He just didn't think of asking. So she's the one who's walked up, to the top of the stadium, and the dining room is on the roof, and she's told, no, you can't go in there. We have a little picnic table over here for you. And she walks over, and there's a sign that says Ladies Pavilion, where she's supposed to eat by herself. So who would have thought that, these were the things that would happen? But because of that, by the time I arrive and I have my pass, I can go on the field. I can be in the dugout when the manager comes out. I can go through the tunnel and all of that. The main thing that I am excluded from at that point when I arrive is the clubhouse. And that includes the clubhouse in the pregame clubhouse, where no player is changing out of his uniform. There is no issue of a player taking a shower or possibly being naked in my presence. And I could not go in for those 50 minutes when magazine writers in particular had time to spend with the ball players to do their kind of stories. I was then also not allowed in after the game, where they focused on the fact that I would see naked men. So, but I became a gradualist. You're right. That's an interesting word. And I was particularly a gradualist with the New York Yankees because I was based in New York, and the Yankees were such a soap opera of a story at that point, and also playing damn good baseball. So I spent a lot of time with the Yankees that season. And Mickey Morabito, who was a very young PR person, he wasn't one of the older men sort of feeling this need to protect his ball players, understood, listened to me quietly. I always went to him in private, not in front of other people. I did not make demands. I did not try to force my way in to the clubhouse and, create a scene. But Mickey began to work with me. And you're right, at mid-season in 1977, he came to me and he said, I've really heard what you've said, and I can't get you into the clubhouse yet. But he said, why don't you come around and meet me at the side door? I'll go in the front door. I'll come around to the side. We won't involve anyone else, and I'll just open the side door, and you can come into Billy Martin's office after each of the games. He said, then you'll get a sense of what the guys are hearing from the players, because they'll come in and ask Billy the questions and the rest. So for the rest of the season, I had a seat on the couch in Billy Martin's office, and that's where I would be after every game. And he was right. It began to open up a lot of things about the game and about the kind of things that the players were saying and Billy was saying that I'd never had the possibility of listening to before. And then the last two games of the Yankees season that year, Mickey left for me without telling me. But when I went to pick up my press credentials, he had suddenly given me daily clubhouse pass, which meant that I could go into the clubhouse whenever I wanted. And I saw Mickey on the field. I said, did you mean to leave this for me? And he said, absolutely. You've proven yourself again and again. You could have tried to go in the door to the locker room. You never did. You did everything. And why not? I trust you. I think that you'll be fine. The players know you. They're comfortable with you. And so I was the gradualist again. I only used that daily clubhouse pass before the game because I wanted them to get used to me. I wanted them to see me in another spot. I'd been in the manager's office. Now I'm in the clubhouse. No one's showering. There's shouldn't be a problem. And in fact, no one wrote about it. No one seemed concerned that I was there. And so that's what I did in the American League Championship that the Yankees were in that season. I went into the locker room. So now we get to the 1977 World Series where I'm banned. So I pick up my credential from the baseball writers, and it says that I have access to the field and to the clubhouses and et cetera, to the press, whatever. Okay. Gives me a seat number in the press box. And so I realized right away that the Yankees are going to be fine with it. No one's written about it. No one's complained. I haven't been thrown out. I've behaved myself. It's all worked out so far. But I realized the Dodgers are coming into play, and they've never had a woman who's covered their team. So no one told me to do it, but out of courtesy, out of a mother may I notion, out of wanting to be sure that things would work out for the players and for me, I went to Tommy Lasorda, the manager first, who I knew very well from the season before. We'd gotten to know each other well. He looked white as a ghost when I told him about my experience with the Yankees and asked if I could interview him. Originally, all I wanted was access to the manager. I thought, again, I'll do this as a gradualist. And he just wasn't going to hear of it. He wasn't going to talk about it. He wanted to run away. And behind him, as we were talking, came Tommy John, who was the player rep for the Dodgers. He introduced me to Tommy. He said, he's the guy who will handle it with you. So Tommy John and I went out to the dugout. And Tommy John spent 20 minutes with me sitting in the dugout. He looked at the clubhouse pass. He listened to me talk about the evolution with the Yankees. He heard me out, and he turned and he said, I'd be very uncomfortable if you were in the locker room, but I, speaking as Tommy John, feel that you have a right to be there. but I want to take it back to the players, and I want to let them know. I want to talk with them about it. So will you meet me tomorrow before the first game? This was at the workout on Monday. Will you meet me there at the backstop so that I can privately share with you what happened? And so I met him at the backstop that Tuesday night before the game. And he said it wasn't unanimous, but it was a majority of players understand you have the right to be there. But he said, just expect that there may be some who are going to be, voicing their dislike of you. And I said, Tommy, I understand, but I thank you for everything you've done. I start walking away. And he said, wait a minute. Can you go find our PR person and tell him about this decision? Because I'm just telling it to you. I haven't seen him. I didn't know their PR person. I didn't owe them this. I didn't have to do this. But again, as a courtesy, I said, yes, I will. So I went and found Steve Brennan, who was their PR person. Again, Steve was very short with me, was very distressed by what I was telling him. And it was in the fifth inning of the game that I was called up to the main press box. And by then, as I've understood it, Steve had told the head of media for the commissioner's office. The commissioner had been informed, and the commissioner had decided that I was to be banned from both locker rooms. And this was not only for the entire World Series, but as he told me that night, he said, forever, as long as I am commissioner. And so that's how it came about. I wasn't looking for a fight, certainly with baseball or the commissioner. I was looking to do this really under the radar to try to really do it in a way that would respect the players, would give me the ability to gradually grow my job so that I could feel comfortable and they could feel comfortable. And I had every reason to believe that that strategy was working well, given what had happened with the Yankees. But then it got totally derailed that night. And that is what led to what I write about in Locker Room Talk, which is the federal court case. We tried to negotiate, Sports Illustrated, in the persons of the baseball editor and the lawyer. I was never invited into those conversations. So I'm going to use the big we. Sports Illustrated tried to negotiate. They went through various things. I'm not going to go into all the minutia, but it was very clear by November to them that the separate but equal was as far as they were going to go. They were not going to give me equal access. And that's when Time Inc. reached out to their outside counsel, which they brought in and made the decision to file the federal lawsuit that we ended up in court over. Yeah.
And I'm going to get to that in a second, but there's one quick question just about, a newsletter for my city councilor, and he had a line, something, good leaders not only accept, but embrace meaningful change. Why was that? I mean, Bowie Kuhn's long gone, but why was that just so hard for baseball people? Why couldn't they see that, the change had arrived by 1977?
Well, it actually had arrived by 1975 when both the NBA and the NHL, without having to go to court, acquiesced to the notion that women were covering those sports, and they were covering them in greater numbers than the women covering baseball, in part because at that point they were considered to be more the two minor of the major sports. Football and baseball were on the top, and basketball still wasn't the sport that it is today. Michael Jordan hadn't arrived yet, et cetera. So you still had hockey and basketball, and that's where most of the women who went to newspapers, and at that time, newspapers needed only one woman, and when she got there, they assigned her to either hockey or basketball. Okay. So baseball always considered itself, and I do address this in the book because I think it's important. When the situation in 75 happened and baseball commissioner could see that these two leagues were giving their women reporters equal access, although it was, gradual and taking time for various teams to agree to it. But it was happening, and the commissioners were saying it should happen. That was when Bowie Kuhn secretly created a policy in which he would keep women out of all clubhouses. That policy was sort of put into a desk drawer. It was never announced. And that's the policy that he was drawing out when I became the woman who gave him reason to use it for the first time in 77. Baseball always considered itself, and it was considered at that point, the national pastime. It was a sport that had legend, it had poetry, it had songs, it had a history, it had a statistical history that you followed back in time. You had the heroes of yesteryear, you had the Black Sox scandal. You had all of this. It was a sport that was sort of bigger than sports itself. It was a cultural experience. At that time, there was an advertisement running about apple pie, Chevrolet, and baseball, right? I mean, it was the cultural touchstone. And Bowie Kuhn would often say it's the family sport, and that he wasn't going to risk, his family sport for something that he considered to be indecent.
Yeah,
he was a very, very strong practicing Catholic. And I do write in the book that at one point, because I went back and looked at speeches that he had gone back to give at his alma mater of Princeton, and he gave one that talked about how his Catholicism led him to take the job as commissioner. And at that point, I kind of give this sense that he was looking at himself as sort of the father figure of baseball, and he was sort of dictating to me as though I were his daughter or someone, what was indecent for me to do, what wasn't right, what wasn't moral, what wasn't the thing that a lady should do. I think there was a lot of moral, and morals that were part of it from his perspective. Plus, he just felt that baseball was on another plane, that the things that had happened with the other sports shouldn't pertain to him. I'll tell you one quick story that my colleague Frank DeFord, a brilliant writer, set out about this time a little bit before then in the mid-70s to do a feature story on the four commissioners, the three commissioners and the president of the hockey. And he interviewed each man, and sort of in the Barbara Walters way, at the end of the interview, he asked each of them to tell him what they slept in. And, some of them, Pete Rozelle, I think, said he slept, nude, except when his grandchildren were around. I may be confusing them, but three of them, other than Bowie Kuhn, were happy to participate. And they made, they were funny, and they made light of it, etc. And Commissioner Kuhn said to DeFord that he wouldn't answer such a question. He refused. And DeFord wrote about him as just being so uptight and so just sort of, puritanical in some ways. So I think it was a mixture of his own temperament and his own notion of where baseball stood as a cultural icon.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, and that's just what got me about it, was just the other leagues were kind of like, well, let's do this. There's a quote for, I think, the president of the NHL at the time was Clarence Campbell. They still have a trophy named, one of the conference champion trophies is still named after him. And he was just like, why not? And your friend Robin Herman and Madeleine Saint-Cyr got to go in the locker room in 1975.
Went into it right in the All-Star game. Yeah, in 1975, and that was it. Yeah. And Robin was, Robin Herman wrote that she was perplexed. I mean, it wasn't she who asked at that particular time. It was a reporter for the Boston Herald-American who was sort of kidding around with the coaches and said, "Hey, coach, are you going to let these two women in tonight?" And the coaches, figuring that these aren't their teams, they're in Canada. They're going home. Who's going to know? And so they made a joke of it. And Robin went up to the coaches privately afterwards and said, if you open the locker rooms to me, that you should be letting the players know that I'm going to be there. She was, again, trying to be the mother may I, trying to help them to understand how this could work. And they didn't pay attention to her at all. So when she actually walked in, all hell broke loose. She became the story, and it was an awful, awful evening for her. But anyway, it did lead to them opening up the locker rooms in time, over time. It took a while after that, but yeah.
I did read something Saint-Cyr wrote in 2018 for Radio Canada, en français, and my French is mediocre at best. And she just said Guy Lafleur just looked at her and go, Ben Christ, t'es là. Oh, Christ, you're here. And then they just were like, well, you're here. Okay, let's.
Well, that wasn't how it played out for Robin. I mean, there were a lot of antics. She was interviewing one player who she knew very well. Another player came and ripped the towel off of him, thinking that was funny. I mean, it was really juvenile, puerile humor, that embarrassed her and was just a rather awful scene for her. But anyway,
I'm not mistaken. I think Guy Lafleur only had sisters growing up, so maybe he was a little different growing up in Thurso, Quebec. Yeah. So I guess we really should cover the case. We've been talking for over an hour. We haven't even talked about the landmark case. I guess what was just sort of in your writerly and research process, Melissa, what was just sort of the trial and error, figuring out how am I going to tell this? Because it moves, those chapters on the trial they move as well as a courtroom drama you'd watch on TV, and we all know those dramatize and leave out a lot of the legal minutia.
Well, I did have the transcript. So that was like if you're creating the foundation and the structure, the skeleton for a building. And then it was my job to figure out how to, make the rooms in it come alive inside that building, with backhoeing some of my story in as the court case went on. It was a kind of writing I'd never challenged myself to do before. So it took me a little longer than I thought it would. But in the end, it was a very satisfying structure for me. I think the long and short of it for your listeners, who I hope will be interested in maybe reading it themselves, is that my lawyer, who's a man named F.A.O. Schwarz, and yes, the great-great-grandson of the founder of F.A.O. Schwarz Toy Store, but more importantly, a gifted and extraordinary lawyer who is fortunately still with us to see this book come out, and applaud him for his legal acumen. But he, from the very beginning, understood that this court case deserved to be in a federal court, and his aim was for it to be decided based on my constitutional rights, the 14th Amendment and the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause. The First Amendment was also mentioned, but it wasn't the key building point. And I'm going to try to make this very short and concise, but it is a challenging legal concept to understand in American law. If you are suing, which we were, or fighting in court in a legal case, entities that are privately owned, as the New York Yankees were and Major League Baseball was. It was not that we were fighting and saying that I had been discriminated against by a public accommodation or something that had a government entity behind it. So the challenge for my attorney was to use a legal precedent called the state action doctrine. To make it very short and understandable, he had to show our judge that in some way what happened to me at Yankee Stadium, that the commissioner of baseball imposed a gender discriminatory action against me at Yankee Stadium, that was somehow entwined with, connected to a government entity. The way in which he did that was to take as precedent a case from the civil rights era, racial discrimination case in the 1960s, early 60s, in which it was determined that a Black man who had gone into a restaurant and been refused service in a restaurant that was based in a publicly funded parking garage was analogous to my situation, and here's how. I am that Black man, only in this case, it's gender discrimination, and I am the woman who is refused entrance to a clubhouse in Yankee Stadium. Yankee Stadium had an infusion of city funds, $50 million, from the taxpayers of New York to rebuild that stadium in 74 and 75. And there was a 30-year lease with the Yankees had with the city for the stadium. That became analogous to that 61 case, which was Burton v. Wilmington Parking Authority. So our case rose or fell on whether he could get the judge to accept that the precedent of that state action doctrine applied so that she could rule on constitutional grounds. And obviously, baseball's argument was to say that that was not the case, that the city had nothing to say about the Yankees' policies or baseball's policies of how the clubhouse would be. So it was an interesting legal argument. Now, the kicker on this, and which I think makes the book exceptionally interesting, is that the judge in my case happened to be drawn by lottery. She was the only woman of 27 judges sitting on the Southern District Court of Manhattan, but she was also the first Black woman in America ever appointed to the federal bench. And she had been in her job working with Thurgood Marshall in the NAACP, Legal and Education Defense Fund, the co-counsel for the Supreme Court case in Wilmington v. Parking Authority. No one knew that case better than she did.
Yeah, that's of course Constance Baker Motley. Yeah.
Constance Baker Motley, who Katinka, Brown Jackson said when she was nominated to be the first Black woman appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court, said if not for the time in which she lived, Constance Baker Motley would have been the first Black woman sitting on the Supreme Court. But anyway, that's the judge that we had in my case. So my book is not just about my case, but it's really about understanding how the legacy of the law from the civil rights movement grows and is buttressed by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who for 6 years in the early 70s works her tail off to try to get the Supreme Court to raise the scrutiny of gender up to where it was in terms of racial discrimination cases. She doesn't quite get it there, but she raises it out of the ordinary to intermediate status. That's in 1976, and my case is filed in 77, and my judge, chosen by lottery, a spin of the wheel, and the clerk pulls out her name. So there we are. So my case has a broader story to tell about the history of equal rights fight, both in racial justice and passing the baton to gender justice. And here we have in the personification of Justice Constance Baker Motley and me as a very young plaintiff of that era, arguing for equal rights based on gender discrimination as one of the first major cases to do that. So I came to understand this only years later. I hope you got from reading my book that I'm sitting in that courtroom, and when my attorney raises this case to the judge's attention, and they have this back and forth where she tells him, by the way, I was co-counsel. I think I know this case, Mr. Schwartz. I'm like, what the hell does a parking authority case have to do with mine? I don't understand what's going on at all. I'm 26 years old sitting in the back of a courtroom. But I've done my homework. I've done my homework. I now understand it. Yeah, I now understand it. And I'm able to tell a story that is both a lot more complicated, but in some ways a lot more interesting than I even understood it to be at the time.
Yeah. And I'm thinking, just for an example, after I read the part about the Wilmington Parking Authority, I thought, okay, well, here in Hamilton, Ontario, where I live, there's a historic building called the Lister Block, and the city owns it, but private businesses, including a great coffee place whose name is escaping me right now, and a restaurant called the Electric Diner that my nephew loves because they have 1982 video games that he can play.
That's
That's
always
the
good.
example for the audience. And of course, when I was reading about, okay, they got Justice Motley, this must be the luckiest draw of all time. But what do we find out when you look at it from her perspective, and how a real judge just doesn't go, well, these people are a bit like-minded to me, I'm going to agree with them. That's not what a judge does.
No,
though.
not at all. Not at all. And Jamiko Brown-Nagin, who has written the comprehensive biography of Justice Motley that came out 2 years ago, and I've now read that, and I've read her, her papers that she did for law journals. She went back and looked at the history of Judge Motley's record across a variety of different kinds of cases that she handled at the district court through her long service there. And if you look at the cases that involve the 14th Amendment, she ruled more often in favor of the defendant rather than the plaintiff. So people who thought that because of her history as a plaintiff's attorney during the racial discrimination cases of the civil rights, that she would just be, okay, well, you're right. Plaintiffs are always right here. That was not the case at all. And there have been some people who have argued, and I've read their law papers, that were we to be doing that case today, and the interpretations that have happened since then of the state action doctrine and its application, that we may well not have won the case. It was not a slam dunk by any stretch. And in fact, there were rumors that Commissioner Kuhn, when he heard that she had been put on the case, that his figuring was, well, she'll probably rule for them for the reasons that you state, but we'll certainly win it in an appeal because the appellate court is going to have some sensible white men on it, and we'll do fine. They'll understand baseball and they'll get it and we'll be fine. And in fact, when they took it to a summary judgment of an appellate court, the three white men who sat on the Second Circuit Court all ruled to uphold her decision totally. And it was then that they dropped their appeal. So, yes, she had a certain understanding of this, but she also thought that it was just such a silly, stupid case. She hated baseball, hated the Yankees because her husband was a fan, and he ruled the radio. When they drive to Connecticut on weekends, she had to listen to these games. She didn't know anything about sports, but she knew that she hated baseball and hated the Yankees most of all. And so she thought that this was just so silly that we would have brought something as stupid as this into court. And at the end of it, she refused to rule after the hearing, and she sent us back and she said, I cannot believe that you cannot figure this out. You go back and work on it and report back to me in a month or 6 weeks. And in fact, we couldn't work it out, and we had to go back to her. And in the end, she had to write a decision. But she was not a fan of this case, and she told my lawyer, Fritz Schwarz, at events that they would go to after this case, she would say to him when they would be seated with each other at lawyer-judge dinners and stuff like that, she would say to him that she really was astonished by the level of the hate mail that she received in this case. She made a point of saying it to him and saying to him that the hate mail seemed to her almost worse than what she had received or endured during her racial discrimination cases in Southern courts. It was that intense. So, of course, I had to go look it up, and she donated all those letters and papers to an archive at Smith College, from which I quote many of those letters, which you've probably read. But a great deal of hatred came at her for this decision.
Yeah, and then it didn't surprise me. Henry Aaron's no longer around, but early 90s, he brought out an autobiography, and he reprinted all the hate mail he got when he was closing in on Babe Ruth. And I'm reading this as a 14-year-old kid who, as you can see from the video, is whiter than white. And I'm just like, why do people have to be this way? Like, it just, why? Like, I just could not understand. But I guess in terms of, and you cover the coverage of the case too, Melissa. And nowadays, I think every big media outlet has, a lawyer who knows a little about sports that they can talk to for anything. But in that era, I think it was more generalist. What kind of happened instead, that in terms of how the media just didn't understand what the case was about and chose to accept? I think I joked in the intro, they fell hook, line, and sinker for what Bowie Kuhn was putting out there.
Yeah, Bowie Kuhn basically argued that he provided these incredible separate accommodations, that he called it, for us. He did nothing of the sort. I mean, I was around ballparks for 2 seasons, and no PR person ever came up to me and said, would you like to take advantage of our separate accommodations, for where you can interview the players, et cetera. So let's leave that aside. I mean, there were many sort of myths that the sports writers should have known better. I mean, they could have asked me. None did. But again, I think it's very clear that I lost this case in the court of public opinion. There's no question that the public sentiment was against me. I don't remember any particular polls being taken on it, but you could tell by the letters to the editor, by the kind of columns that were written, that I had clearly lost in that court. But I was always reminded by my lawyer that the court that mattered was the court of law. And in the court of law, he felt we had a strong case. And in the end, we did win in the court of law. And so, again, I'm reminded after we won in the court of law, I had a feeling that, things would change and things would be different and it all would be well. But in fact, from the section that you had me read, that's not what happened, because what I've also come to know is that we can change the law faster than we can change public attitudes. And public attitudes take much, much more time to change. And the place that sports held in the lives of men, and the idea that men felt that that was their preserve and their place where they could, be with men, watch men play, etc. Well, the fact that we now have this extraordinary women's sports and such great enthusiasm for it, that's nearly 50 years, after my case, which basically argued, that women ought to have equal rights and equal access to be around even the most male of male sports. I mean, so, it just takes time. It just takes time. But, Kuhn and his people, his media people, had good allies in the male sports writers. I mean, many of them we found out in documents that we got in the discovery phase of our legal case, because they had to turn over confidential memos and stuff. Many of the sports writers, came to the commissioner's office and said, you're not going to do anything that's going to take away our access to the players, are you, in trying to deal with this woman? You're not going to hurt us. Are you? And, the commissioner's office would pledge to them, no, we're not going to do anything that's going to hurt you. So there was a cabal. I mean, there was, kind of the sports writers, for the most part, pretty much took, you're right, sort of hook, line, and sinker, that story. And then they demonstrated absolutely no interest in seeing this as a legal case, because the court hearing was, you could easily find out when the court hearing was in this case, and not one writer in New York City on any of the newspapers, and there were many, showed up to listen to the court hearing. One woman showed up from Editor and Publisher magazine, and that was it. So while they had done, inches and inches and inches of coverage about me and my case, they spoke pretty clearly to me that day, when none of them showed up to even bother to hear what the hearing was about. So they just didn't see it that way.
Yeah. And that's what strikes me kind of as the really, tragic part of it, was just that the lack of leadership from or the kind of leadership from up top, and then it just led into this thing being something that lasted, for decades. One person I did want to ask you about specifically, Melissa,
Sure.
was the late Allison Gordon, because she covered my favorite team, the Blue Jays, although before she had moved on to other things by the time I was old enough to be reading the papers. But why was she maybe the right person to be sort of the first woman on the to cover baseball full time for a newspaper, cover a team full time for a newspaper?
Well, first of all, very, very dear friend of mine, and I write in my book's dedication that this book is for her and other colleagues that we've all lost tragically too young. But Allison was a very dear friend, and my God, when I knew the Blue Jays were coming to town I think it was the 78 season she started, but 79 more so. I was so delighted to see her face. First of all, she had a great sense of humor. She was a fabulous storyteller with a great sense of humor, and she was tough as nails. But she really had a great smile, and she just, she wasn't going to take sort of crap from anyone. But she also presented herself in a way that wasn't, to my eye, at all threatening. She knew what she was up against, and she was doing, in many ways, I think we talked about it many times, maybe the honey gets more, bees or something, right? Than trying to, and again, she was very lonely in the sense that she was the only woman on that traveling press corps. And she was usually the only woman probably in any of the press boxes, et cetera, when she was there in that 79 season. I mean, Claire Smith would start joining her in the early 80s first at the Hartford Courant and then at the New York Times. And it would be very gradual that you'd see more women coming in. But, I left after the 79 season and left Sports Illustrated, and I was not covering baseball anymore. And so she, she was just a gem of a person. And I think that made all the difference. I later found out by reading her books and reading some of her coverage. Of course, we didn't have the internet then, so it wasn't easy for me to get the Toronto paper. She was a hell of a writer. And she loved the sport. I mean, that obviously helped. I mean, both of us love the sport. That's, I think, partly where we found the bonds of our friendship. Here were two women who could just sit and talk baseball and feel like it was completely natural. There was no artifice about it. We just both loved talking it. And there we were, with each other doing what we loved. And I really miss her. And you guys really were so fortunate to have her to chronicle, that team for the seasons that she did.
Yeah, she was there when the Jays were going from expansion to established team. And like I say, I think her last year on the beat was right before I'm old enough to understand, okay, this is baseball. And of course, it was my mom who taught me the rules of the sport.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
And she was the one who impressed on me a walk is often better than a hit, not because I was one of those kids who was a little reluctant to swing at first.
Yeah.
Now, sort of at this time, too, there were times, too, in the book I would read like, oh, okay, my heart would sink. Oh, this writer, Red Smith, for instance, didn't support you. I was like, oh, man. Or someone else who was, a coach who was kind of often associated with being progressive, wasn't supportive. And I guess what, too, does this sometimes say that sometimes the allies are sometimes the most surprising people, and sometimes the people who put their, dig in and get all revanchist are not the ones you'd expect to. And I guess that's maybe...
Well, this broke down by age, I think, a lot. The other thing to understand about baseball and why there were so few women on it, and it took a long time, is that then, if you wanted to be a sports writer, many people's goal was to work their way up the ladder. And at the top of the ladder was being a baseball reporter at that point, being the writer for baseball. It was a year-long job. I mean, you had spring training, you had the whole season, you had the winter meetings. I mean, that was, a job, and you were in the paper all the time. And people loved to read baseball. It had such lore and such stories, et cetera. And so there weren't a lot of people leaving it. And so when you talk about Red Smith, I mean, not only did Red Smith write a very derogatory column about me, but because Red Smith was considered the dean of sports writers, he had won the Pulitzer Prize in sports writing the year before. His words, which were syndicated to thousands of papers throughout Canada and the US off of the New York Times syndicate, set the narrative, framed the narrative. And it gave permission for others to write in the way that he had. As I said earlier, he called me sort of fluff in the clubhouse. He referred to my case as the only laughing matter at the end of a very serious sports season. No, I mean, and you asked earlier why it matters that women are in sports. It mattered to Red Smith, certainly, with that column, because never before had his words been touched by an editor of the New York Times. The reason? Leanne Schreiber, the first and only woman to be the editor of the New York Times sports department, was the editor then. She only got wind of his column after it had been sent out on the syndicated wire with a final paragraph that she excised from his story when it ran in the New York Times. It was about how thrilling it must be for me to go in and see Reggie Jackson in the buff. That was how he ended it. Again, with the same sort of idea that Jane Pauley had, that it was, the only reason I wanted to be there was to leer at naked men's bodies. And she took that paragraph out, creating great fury from him, of course, because no one touched Red Smith's words. And I think she rewrote the headline to have it reflect something more of sort of the notion of it being, I can't remember exactly the headline, but it wasn't an audacious headline as what's put on many of the syndicated columns, because I went and tracked where it went to various newspapers and what headline writers put on it. So did it make a difference that Leanne Schreiber was in that seat? It did indeed. But still, that column set the tone for what would follow. That was on January 9th. That was 10 days after the lawsuit was filed. And from then on, the narrative frame that was most popular was following Red Smith's lead. So that made a huge difference that he wrote the column he did. It wasn't just any old guy writing a column. It was a very influential columm.
Yeah. Yeah, and like I said, it just made my heart sink because here's someone his work's been anthologized, and I've probably quoted his when again I've mentioned the Jays, and he didn't like the name because he said the Blue Jay was a raucous, obstreperous, thieving cannibal who robs the nest of smaller birds. And it was just like, well, okay.
Well, he was a brilliant writer, and he was, he deserved the admiration that he got. On this one, it was a generational issue. I think that's what I was sort of trying to get across and lost that thread. But you find that it was the younger writers who befriended me, who came to my support. It was someone like a Henry Hecht who covered the Yankees for the New York Post. And after the commissioner had done what he'd done to me in the first game, I did not go out to LA for that series because I was left behind. The other baseball reporter, the man, went out, and I was left behind to fact check the story when it came in. But Henry Hecht went out there, and he asked for and got a meeting with the commissioner and raised the question with him about what he had done with me. So it was the younger crew that were roughly my age, and Mickey Morabito, the PR person for the Yankees, who couldn't speak out on my behalf, of course, because he was sort of collared by the baseball hierarchy. But it was people of that generation. And there weren't that many of them who were baseball writers because the old chipmunks were still around and they weren't leaving. The Phil Peppes, the Dick Youngs, all of that generation that were no fans of mine and not interested in women invading their space. So that was the way it was.
Yeah. Well, like I say, I just always think, leading is moving ahead. Yep. I guess too, we've mentioned Reggie Jackson a couple times, and I know you mentioned the book. Sometimes you rode with him to the ballpark. I didn't want to do too much.
I had no other way to interview him. I had to be inventive. I had to be creative. So I found him one time when he was walking in through the dugout, and I couldn't interview him in the locker room before the game, and I certainly couldn't be there after the game. And so I just said to him, "Hey, Reggie, I come up from Manhattan, every day to the game. Could I ride with you in your car?" And so I'd meet him at the exit ramp from under his apartment building. He'd drive out in his Rolls Royce, and I would get in the seat with him, and we would talk on the way to the game. How else was I going to do my job? Right?
Yeah, exactly,
you had to
right.
figure out how to do it, because believe me, if you were a woman back in that time and you had the job that you loved, you knew enough not to whine and complain about things that didn't work out for you, because you could be replaced. You could be replaced. You just had to figure out how to do it. You had to work around it. Don't complain. We got plenty of men here who would love to do this job, Melissa. If you can't do it, we'll just send them up there.
Yeah. And then too, that's the thing I always, why we read the histories, to remember what people had to internalize. And that was what I was coming around to with Reggie Jackson, knowing how he always had the sense of when it's time to deliver and the lights are on, just how informed was it for him to say what he needed to say when there was that special MLB game in Birmingham, Alabama in June.
That was extraordinary. I'd never heard that. And I wrote to friends of mine in emails, private emails, and I said, when I heard Reggie talk about the racism that he experienced and how it made him feel, I realized all that time I'd spent with him, I had never done the kind of research I should have done on his minor league career, and known that he would have potentially faced that by being in the minor leagues in those southern states at that time. And never in all the time that I spent talking to him did I ever raise that with him. And so, I'm not trying to be ego-centered here, but as I took away the pain from that interview, I thought, why did I never understand? I got to know him pretty well. Why did I never understand that and at least have a conversation with him about it? So, there would be a lot of do-overs. If I could go back to my 26 and 27-year-old self and say, hey, wake up, you should be asking this, or you should be looking at this. I did the best I could at the time. But again, we didn't have Google or YouTube or anything like that. So it wasn't as though these things were instantaneously available to us. But
yeah. And two, one thing I've thought about doing journalism this era is if your perspective is off, someone will find you and tell you missed something. And I think I heard Michael Schur, the TV creator, say, well, it's like this instantaneous fact-checking machine. And like I say, when he saw that, I knew he had written about it in his book. To see him say it, and it definitely made everyone sort of, they say in the series, sure as he had to let it marinate. Now, one other person I need to ask about, and I've only got a couple more questions, Melissa. This has been outstanding, but one of my happy place gigs is I get to be an official scorer with the Intercounty Baseball League. So I need to ask, what scorecard keeping trick did Roger Angel teach you?
Oh. I just shared the scoring trick with a friend of mine who took me to Fenway Park. They had an extra ticket and invited me to go to a game the other day. It was the first time I'd actually been to Fenway in a while, because they've kind of outpriced me. Being on Social Security and buying a ticket at Fenway don't always go together. So right now I went and we were talking about this very thing. And we were in a situation where there was some excellent pitching in the game that we went to. And, I turned to my friend and I said, Ann, because I told her about how I used to sit next to Roger Angel and I would learn a lot about scoring from him. I said, Ann, here it is. We've got a batter now that's got a 3-2 count. So whatever happens after that count, he's had the 3-2. So we want to know that. I said, how do you think Roger scored that, so that whenever he'd look back at his scoring sheet, he'd see that it was a 3-2 count? She said, I don't know. She said, I've scored a lot of games, but I don't think I ever did that. And I said, well, I hadn't either, until one night I looked down at his scorecard and I said, Roger, what's that little dot in the middle of the diamond in your score sheet. He said, oh, that's the 3 and 2 count. They get to 3 and 2, I put a dot right in the middle, and then I can see if they end up getting a hit or they walk or they strike out that they got to a 3 and 2 count. I said, wow. So that's one of them.
Yeah, one of them. Yeah. I can't remember who said it was like they're like anyone who scores a game eventually invents their own system anyway.
They do. But he was the one who took me outside of the conventional kind of scoring. And, and then you wonder why he can go back to his scorecards and relive parts of it in ways that I wasn't able to do until I adapted some of his little tricks. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah. And thankfully,
and then I couldn't do it because I couldn't write as well as he did. But, it was just fascinating and wonderful. And, I think back, Roger and I were often seated next to each other, particularly in championship series and World Series games, because we were magazine people. They put the magazine people together. And on that night of that first game of the 1977 World Series, I was seated next to him when the sort of crackling little speaker down in the extra press area where we were sitting in the grandstand, I heard my name, and I turned to Roger. I said, was that my name, Roger? And he said, I think it might have been, but you always knew they were going to repeat it. Like it was there to tell you if the scorer had to go back to you being a scorer. If the scorer had said that it was an error, they would repeat it again over the speaker because it was kind of crackling and tough to pick up. So when it came over again, Roger said, yup, that's you. And that's when I went up to the main press box. So,
yeah, and that just had, like I say, had to ask. What I do now is all digitized. I keep the little scoreboard clicker in my right hand and my enter being left-handed, enter the plays into the system with my left hand, and then keep a paper scorebook anyway. And now when we sometimes reference our previous episodes, we had a former NFL QB Eric Kramer on a while ago, and he told us his mantra that he got from a sports psychologist was "be like water," and that brought me around to because I know you're going to be out on the water later today rowing.
I am going to be on the water rowing. Yes,
I'm almost keeping you from it. But what got you back into that after a few years away?
I'd rowed in college, and actually, as it turned out. At Wellesley College, rowing had been a part of the college since the year it was founded in 1875. But back then, they had sort of rather large whaling dories that they put out on their lake. And the rowers were selected for their singing ability, not their rowing ability. And their job was to row visitors across the lake. And they did that. While singing to them, some of the songs of Great Old Wellesley and Great Lake Waban and all of that. And so I was charged with doing a sort of history of rowing at Wellesley Story for the magazine. So I went back into this history, and I discovered that one of the first guests that they had out on the campus was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who lived in Cambridge, and he took the horse and buggy and went out to Wellesley and was invited to come to what the christening of the Evangeline from his poem. And then they put him in the boat and they rowed him out on the lake and they sang to him. And then they left him off to go up to deliver his poetry thing. And they left him off under crossed oars and the whole thing. But they left him off on such a steep hill that had rocks all over it and stuff that he swore that he would never get in one of those boats again. So I don't think that Henry Wadsworth Longfellow ever got in. But that was where the history began. And by the time I got there in late 60s, fall of 69, the only crew boats that Wellesley had were custom made. And they were custom made for us to row in gym classes, to row in inter-dorm races and inter-class races. And they would not tip over. They had very custom-made oars. They lived in the water. You didn't put them up on racks. And when you came in, they had such a wide berth that you could take your oars and hold them up, and the boatman would pull your boat in. So we had nothing that would be classified as a racing boat that we could race against any other team. until my sophomore year. And someone
Okay.
donated a 4 pocock, an old wooden 4 pocock. And again, my life has turned on serendipity. I walked into the boathouse at exactly the right moment, apparently, because the woman who was the boathouse coach knew very little about rowing, but she was the boathouse coach, pointed at me and said, "You over here in this boat." And that became me being a member of the first intercollegiate rowing team at Wellesley College. Boston Globe was so fascinated that we were actually competing in rowing. They came out and took our picture on the water. It wasn't until 1972, which would have been the fall of my senior year, remember this, that the Head of the Charles, which is the largest rowing race in the world now, would not allow women to row in it in anything other than singles, which they had very few of. So in the fall of 72, Wellesley College was one of the 13 original boats to be an 8. We had to borrow the boat from MIT because we did not have an 8 at Wellesley. Rowed in it. There were 13 boats and Wellesley finished 7th. But that tells you what the status of women in rowing was then. So I rowed through college, and then I left rowing for what I want to say is about 43 years. And raising a single daughter, there was no way I could row because you usually row in the early morning or you row at night. And that's when, being a single mother, you were taking care of the child at one of the other ends of the day. And so after my daughter finished high school and was off to college, I had a friend who was going to a local rowing club called Community Rowing. And she met me for coffee one morning and I said, "What are you doing over here?" And she said, "Well, I'm learning how to erg and going to row in the spring." And I said, "Are you what? What?" And she said, "Why don't you come do it with me?" She had never rowed in college. She had also gone to Wellesley. She'd never rowed, but she thought it would be great fun to do. So I said, "Of course, count me in." And so that was 9 years ago. So I've been rowing for 9 years again. And the good news is that I finally got my bucket list. I finally rowed in the Head of the Charles because my senior year, when that boat raced in the Head of the Charles, I was in California. I had gone away to school my senior year. So that's the thing I missed most about being away. And so I made it up and I was in a bucket list race with my club, Community Rowing. And it was just a fabulous experience to have that bucket list kind of finally come to fruition. And I will be rowing again tonight with my wonderful, what we call general sweeps class. I think there are going to be 45 of us who show up tonight, men and women, all ages. And we go out and row. We have coaches and we learn and we race. And I was in a race this weekend. I was coxing, but I had a race that I did, 1,000-meter race that I brought a crew out to. So, you know, it's just a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful thing to do. So I'm lucky. Yeah. What can I say?
And I thought, well, there's a good. I thought that would be a good closer, since you know, as we just to say, hey, like, you know, always the bucket list is always a living document, so to speak, and. Melissa, this has been wonderful. I hope I've done justice to.
Oh my God, you have been just such a treat to talk to. I mean, I've probably gone on much too long in my stories, but you know, when you hit the passion button, it happens. I just kind of get carried back, and with all the research I've gone back and finally done to really put the pieces together that I didn't understand then. And a lot of pieces I didn't understand about how what I went through as a woman at that time affected my personal life and how I made some bad decisions. I write about those quite openly, you know, in my book. You know, I'm kind of putting myself out there, and it feels okay because I feel like I'm telling a story that relates to the same processes that women unfortunately still go through today if they put themselves out there in the way that I did, or even through our Me Too generation, as so many women have courageously done in that regard, including athletes. So, so thank you. Thank you for your
You're
interest,
welcome. You're
and thank
welcome.
you for your fabulous questions and your forbearance at letting me tell my stories.
Well, I'm shy. I sometimes don't interject. I'm a rule follower. What can I say? Thank you so much. And again, for the listeners, the book is Locker Room Talk, A Woman's Struggle to Get Inside by Melissa Ludtke. Publication date August 16th, 2024, Rutgers University Press, and distributed by a UBC Press in Canada.
Terrific. Oh, my God. It's going to happen. Thank you.